Tēnā koe, haere mai encore une fois, welcome again to the second part of the introductory unit about the economic problem. And what we're examining here is the model, the graphical model that illustrates the economic problem and the related concepts of scarcity, choice, and opportunity cost. So when we begin, you will need to keep your photocopy notes beside you because there will be some things to complete as you work through your student notes. So concentrate. Now, the economic problem is also known as the problem of scarcity. Human wants are unlimited, as we've already learnt, and resources available to satisfy those wants are limited in supply. Therefore, we have to make choices, whether as individuals, consumers, producers, governments and societies. We have to make decisions about how we're going to use those limited resources. How are they going to be shared out? You can produce an example below, you can write one to help you remember. It could be just a simple one like choosing your lunch. And remember that opportunity cost is giving up the next best choice, not all the choices that might have it. It's thinking about lunch, going down and thinking you might like sushi, you might like noodles, you might like a sandwich. So you've got three choices. Let's say you choose the noodles as your first choice, and your second choice is the sushi, and your third is the sandwich. Well, the opportunity cost of choosing the noodles is the sushi, which is the next best choice. Now, the problem facing societies, facing individuals, facing businesses, what are known as the three allocation questions. Who is going to get the resources? What are the resources going to be used to produce? How are they going to be produced, and for whom to produce? And so these allocation questions are really about allocating the scarce resources, which are limited, and they need to be shared out. Another word is rationed, less common. The T is silent in ration. Rationed is to share out. So what to produce, how to produce, for whom? These are the allocation questions. Shall we put our resources into making military weapons or food? And every country will choose depending on their particular needs, their particular situations. If you look at Russia, China, United States, they allocate a lot of resources into the military, into the Army, Navy, Air Force. New Zealand allocates very little of its resources into that area because New Zealand, unlike those three countries, is a very small country and quite insignificant in the world. And so it doesn't have to worry too much about defending itself or imposing itself to get what it wants. And the positive benefit of this is that New Zealand doesn't have to allocate many resources into that part of its economy. How to produce? Who decides that? Is it individuals? Is it government? Or is it both? How are those decisions made? And who will actually benefit? For whom to produce? These are the big questions. And so what we're going to do is look at them in the next few slides about how societies have actually made those choices. What type of economic systems have evolved and developed. Now, three economic systems have evolved or developed
in order to allocate these scarce resources. And the first is based on custom or tradition. So it's known as the traditional economy based on custom. In other words, what to produce is decided on what has been produced in the past. And the past determines very much what will be produced in the present. How to produce, again, would be very much determined by the past. As your father taught you how to carry out a task, to do something, you will do it in that particular way. A traditional economy, its main disadvantage is that it doesn't change very much because people do things the way their elders have done them. And so if new ideas come along, then there's a natural resistance or an inbuilt resistance to change because it's not what was done in the past. So traditional economies are slow to change and they tend to be relatively poor. You would say China pre-1949, after the Great Walk of Chairman Mao and his friends, before that China was very much a traditional economy. And it was an economy that was very, very stagnant, I suppose, where people, the vast majority of the population was extremely poor. A few people had a lot of wealth, but fundamentally it was an economy that wasn't really growing, and the vast majority of the people were poor. Now, China, after Chairman Mao took control and instituted a communism, which was or is a political philosophy based on equality, on equal sharing, of making sure that the resources are allocated fairly, and that fairly meant as equal as possible. And of course, to do this, you had to allow the government to make the choices, because by nature individuals will look after themselves and their family first. So the government stepped in, and basically communism was based on the operation of the government making decisions about what to produce, how to produce, and for whom. And so we saw in China, post-communism, in the early stages, the economy began to grow. Not rapidly, but because a lot of the traditions that were resisting technological change or just change were imposed, that was no longer a free choice, that many new things were instituted. And so it did help break or free China from that traditional yoke. But of course, the government is probably not the best decision maker when it comes to individual needs. And so the Chinese economy did slow down. And so it was really in the late 1970s, early 80s, that the Chinese government recognized the need to give more freedom to individuals to choose what to produce and how to produce. And those individuals needed to be rewarded for their individual efforts. So more private ownership was allowed. And of course, as with private ownership comes the incentive to work hard or harder, because as a business, the more successful it is, the more profit will go to the individual owners. And so it began to develop more and more into what we would call a market economy, where the individuals decide what, how, and for whom to produce. And before we go on to the market economy, when we think of the changes in China, one of the other things that accompanied this individual freedom was also an openness towards the rest of the world. China was fairly closed and not very forthcoming about trading internationally, except with countries that had similar philosophies. But China realized if it was going to grow, it needed to trade to be able to increase its production possibility frontier. And so China embraced international trade and now has become probably the largest trading nation in the world. And so the change into the market, where individuals become more and more free to choose what they want, has been extremely beneficial to China because we've seen rapid economic growth, averaging up until recently 10% every year, which is about 3 times faster or more than most developed economies. And so we've seen how successful the change to orientate the economy more towards individual choice. But that's not to say that China is like the United States or New Zealand, where the individuals have a large amount of freedom, but that freedom has been extended and the openness to trade has grown. Now, the market economy is not perfect by any means, and we'll see as we go into section B of this course later that you will study what is known as market failure. And markets based on individual freedom and individual capacity or ability to succeed makes winners and losers, because it's a competitive system, and where you get losers, especially where there are too many losers, or those losers actually become a burden for society, then we say that the market is failing. It's not producing an equitable outcome. And so market economies are not perfect by any means. They're good for stimulating economic growth, but they tend to create inequalities of wealth, uneven distribution of income. So some people get super rich and many others stay super poor. And we would say the market has failed if it produces that type of outcome. But that will be looked at later in the course. So the problem is knowing or finding the best way to allocate the scarce resources. And as we've discussed, societies have developed 3 basic choices or economic systems to do this. So according to the diagram, the cartoonist, how will the food be shared out? How will it be allocated? Now you can see there are 7 people present at the table. There's only one chop, the limited resource if you like. And so who's going to get it? Is it going to be shared out equally, regardless of each person's needs, just shared out equally? You would say that would be a sort of a pure communism model, or that it will be shared out based on equality but according to need. And so, for example, the neediest of the group would receive the most, but the aim would still be to share it out as equally as possible. Communism. Or would it be tradition? Middle Eastern societies would serve the male members first. So if you're a man, you were lucky, or a boy, lucky, but if you're a girl, you'd have to wait, or a lady. The third possibility is the market or capitalist economy. And of course, when you look closely at the caption, firstly, now the lady says there's only one chop, so you have to be quick. So that indicates straight away that there's going to be a battle or a fight or a competition to get this scarce resource. So of course it's a cartoon about capitalism or the market economy, and of course we see the plaque on the wall, the picture, competition is good. So who's going to get it? It's going to be the strongest, maybe the fastest, the sneakiest, the most dangerous, the one with the knife in their pocket, who knows? But it's based on competition. And so there are going to be winners and losers. Maybe one winner, maybe two, if they collaborate, work together to defeat the others. But in any case, competition creates winners and losers. Is that a bad thing? Well, it's good to think about it, isn't it? So this task really is just a summary of the 3 economic systems that have been presented. And from the word list below, as you read, you select the word that you think goes in the missing space. And that will provide a useful way to help you remember the basic ideas discussed. Now we're going to take these ideas, these big ideas related to the economic problem, the problem of scarcity, and the consequent choices that have to be made because resources are scarce. And the third concept, of course, is opportunity cost. Every time we make choices, we have to give up the next best alternative. And this, of course, is known as opportunity cost. And what we can take them and place them in a graphical model to illustrate how they work. And so here we have a table showing student time management. And of course, students do 2 things, 2 basic things. They either study, or work if you like, or they don't study. In other words, they take leisure. And by leisure, I mean not studying. In other words, you sleep, you eat, you play computer games, probably too much, and do other things as well. And of course, that's part of your not studying. And so you can see in the table, there are 5 choices, A, B, C, D, E. So there are 5 choices or possibilities. Now, of course, you've got your most precious limited resource, and that is time. For you as a student, you've got 24 hours in the day, no more. In other words, your time is limited. Each day you have a maximum number of hours, and that is 24 hours. And you can see from the table, if you were a super lazy student, you would be at point A, because you'd spend 24 hours enjoying leisure or not studying, which means 24 hours of leisure means 0 hours of study, no time. You've used it all up, not studying. Okay, super student would be at the other extreme, at point E. At point E, he studies 24 hours a day, and he takes no leisure. Doesn't sleep, doesn't eat, or if he eats, he's still studying. An amazing student. I'm sure there are a few of you here like that. Now, if you go to the more reasonable choices of B, C, or D, they're showing how a student would allocate their time. Now, what I want you to do is actually draw a production possibility curve of a student using their time. And it doesn't matter which axis, whether Y or X, you can put study or leisure. And so I want you to complete the graph showing the points and connecting the points up. Don't forget to label the axes and then answer those questions. So let's provide a definition for production possibility curves, PP curves for short, and remember that they're illustrating the concepts of scarcity, choice, and opportunity cost. So a definition, is a good one to memorize, is that the production possibility model shows the maximum possible amounts of two goods that can be produced, or types of goods that can be produced using a fixed level of resources and technology. Sometimes the examiner will pose the question in the form of asking for the two assumptions underlying the model. And again, there can only be two goods or types of goods compared, because you've only got an X and Y axes, if you like, and that resources and technology must be fixed in supply. Otherwise, if the curve can move out, then there will be a new set of possibilities. This question here is answered below with the missing words to be placed in the gaps. So as you complete that, you will have a model answer for this question. Explain how PP curves illustrate the concepts of scarcity, choice, and opportunity cost. So I'll leave you to do that. Here we have a table showing the production possibilities in car production. You've got two types of possibilities, or two types of cars: standard model, the basic model, and the deluxe model, which has the extras. It's more luxurious. And so the first question says, what is the maximum possible numbers that can be produced of standard model cars? Well, you just simply read along, and you can see 320 is the maximum possible. Of deluxe models, 240. What is the opportunity cost of producing 240 deluxe model cars? Well, what's given up? Well, you're giving up the possibility of producing 320 standard model cars. If all resources are transferred to produce only deluxe model cars, then there are no resources left to produce standard model cars. In other words, you've given up 320 standard model cars in order to produce your first preference, which is 240 deluxe model cars. If the car firm is producing at point C, how many deluxe model cars can be produced? 120. So what's the opportunity cost of producing this quantity of deluxe model cars? Well, you can also produce 160 standard model cars, but you've given up the possibility, if you had put all your resources into producing standard model cars, you could have produced 320. So the opportunity cost of choosing to produce at point C is the 160 standard model cars that could have been produced. If demand increased for standard model cars, which resulted in the car firm moving from point C to point D, what is the opportunity cost of this change? So moving from C to D, you gained another 80 standard model cars, but to do that you have to transfer your resources, or some of them, away from deluxe model production. So you're going to give up 60 deluxe model vehicles in order to get another 80 standard model ones. Now, taking the figures shown in the production possibility schedule you've got the choices or possibilities, and what we are going to do now is put them into a production possibility curve. And it doesn't matter which axis is the standard and which is deluxe. The y and x axes are not important. So as we plot, we'll put standard on the y-axis, deluxe on the horizontal x-axis. Work out our scale, which is very simple to do from the figures. And then first combination or possibility, A, B, C, D, E. Connect the points up and we have a straight line. Simple. Right, the production possibilities here are for a farmer either to use his land, which is of course fixed in supply, and his technology, which is also fixed in supply, and he's got various possibilities. In fact, he's got 5 possibilities or choices or alternatives to produce either kumara or onions. He could put all his resources into producing kumara, and he could produce 400 tons of kumara. But that means of course he could produce no onions. Or conversely, he could choose to put all his resources into onion production and produce 1,000 tons, and of course he would produce nothing, no kumara. And so each of the combinations A, B, C, and D, and E represent those possibilities or choices. Now you need to complete the graph, and you'll recognize that it's not a straight line, it's concave, and concave simply means bowed out from the origin being the starting point at 0, and it's bowed out. Now we're going to introduce a new term known as production efficiency. Now remember, efficiency always refers to how well resources are being used. And there are 2 aspects to efficiency as we look at it in section A. And the first is that, are the resources fully used? And if the resources are fully used, the economy has reached its capacity to produce, its productive capacity. So any point on the frontier on the curve, for example A, B, C, D, the farmer has reached his maximum capacity to produce. So it would not be possible to produce any more lambs at C without transferring some of the resources used to produce wheat, for example, the land and the labor. And so you would have to give up production of wheat in order to increase production of lambs. So we say that production efficiency depends on, firstly, reaching the producer's capacity to produce. In other words, to use all his resources fully. And this is known as production efficiency. So it's attained at any point on the PPQ. If we are producing inside the curve, say at point E, we're underutilizing our resources. In other words, some of our resources are not fully employed. At point E, the producer is underutilizing existing resources, and in other words, there are unemployed resources, and they're not being efficiently used. And of course, the challenge in all businesses is to find ways to make sure that resources are fully used. So how do we get from point E to point F? How do we use our resources fully? Or just use them more efficiently? And often it's through worker training, for example, so their skills and productivity increase so they can reach their capacity. Or it could be that some workers are just not working fully. You could take ACG as an example, me as an economics teacher, and for me to be fully employed, I need to be teaching up to 16 sessions per week. And let's say some students decide they don't like economics and they change to, say, physics. Well, then I end up teaching, let's say, 13 sessions, but then I'm underutilized. I'm not fully employed, because to be fully employed, to reach my capacity as an individual unit, I need to be teaching 16 sessions. Now, the ACG could train me so that perhaps I could teach physics. And so for that, those teaching sessions that I'm not teaching, I could then take up teaching of physics as well as economics to reach my productive capacity. Of course, better management techniques or organisation of resources so that the resources will be used more efficiently. So basically, the key idea from moving from E to F is that you've got at E unemployed resources. So as those resources are employed, as they're used, as they're utilised, then you'll move towards productive efficiency where all resources will be fully used. We've been talking about production efficiency and reaching our capacity to produce, and our capacity to produce depends on the resources that we have available and the technology. And so we know that the area inside the curve represents our productive capacity. So if we talk about point G, is it possible to get there? Well, it's impossible if we have a fixed amount of resources and technology, because we can't produce any more than the inside curve, represented by the red line. To get out to G, we need either to get more resources or more technology. In other words, we need to increase our productive capacity. So, for example, if you're talking about wheat production, as we can see here, if scientists develop a more disease-resistant plant, then through technology, the capacity to produce wheat has increased. If the scientists developed better products to fertilize the grass so it'll grow more efficiently, then there would be an increase in the capacity to produce lambs, because of course lambs are pastoral animals, they eat grass. And so if grass production was increased, you would see the capacity of lamb production increase, no change in wheat production. So the curve can move out from either end, or it can move out at both ends, depending on what resources or technology is added to increase the productive process. So how do we move from F, which is our limit, our productive limit? We can't produce any more than F unless we get more resources or more technology. So very simply, if the farmer gets more resources, like he gets more land or labour, capital, technology, the capacity to produce will increase, and so the frontier, the curve will move out. So the simple answer is get more resources, get more technology. So this slide focuses on a more macroeconomic aspect. In other words, well, how can we make economies grow? Now, of course, most economies are inside the curve, working towards reaching their productive capacity. But if they wanted to increase their capacity to produce, often there is a difficult choice to make because, especially with poorer countries, in order to be able to increase their capacity to produce, they have to invest in, for example, education, so that their workforce is better educated, more skilled. And so to do that, they have to take resources away from consumer goods. Remember, consumer goods are goods just used for themselves. Capital goods are goods that produce more goods. They are part of the whole technological process that will lead to an increase in capacity to produce. So here what we are looking at is the importance of capital good, but moving from point A to point B involves an opportunity cost and a difficult choice too, because to move from A to B, assuming that all resources are fully employed, then consumer goods have to be given up in order to put more resources into capital. And so that could be a difficult shorter term choice, as these economies often can be quite poor. And so to give up consumption of capital goods, consumer goods, would be not an easy choice to make. But in the longer term, because more resources are transferred into, let's say, education, you get a more skilled workforce, a workforce that can utilize the technology or to be able to develop technology to see economies grow. So this here is really a summary of what I've just said. So your task is to take the words and put them in the correct space. So this slide is really just adding to your vocab. You've heard the term a developed economy, a developing economy, an underdeveloped economy, and basically those three terms are referring to how fully are resources utilized. So you could take 3 points inside the curve to represent three different economies, and the most developed would be closest to full employment, in other words, closest to the curve. Point A, on the other hand, would represent a country that has not utilized, it's not developed its resources, and the reason it can't, of course, is that it probably won't have much money to deal with it. So Zimbabwe would be an example in the world today of a very poor country, while New Zealand would be the best example of that, China and Zimbabwe, of a rich or developed country. And of course a developing economy is one that's using its existing resources more fully, and that would be China. So here are some revision questions on interpreting the production possibility schedule, so I'll leave you to complete those. This slide offers you more opportunity to be able to transform the production possibility schedule into a production possibility curve, showing the production possibilities of sheep and cows. Once you've completed it, answer the questions. If you have any queries about answers, don't hesitate to ask in the next teaching session. Here are two multiple choice questions, and there are two more on the following slide. And you have choices A, B, C, and D. You only can choose one, and you have to choose the most likely reason for the change. Here you can see that apple production has increased as you move from point E on the curve to point F, and lamb production has to decrease because resources are limited and they're fully used at point E and point F. So to increase apple production, you have to give up lamb production. You have to transfer some resources from lamb production into apple production. So the question says, which of the following would have caused that movement? Well, if you look at A, an increase in the cost of producing apples would almost certainly lead to a decrease in the production of apples. So it would be a movement back towards zero along the y-axis. Bad weather during the fruit picking season would mean that the amount of apples harvested would be less, so apple production would decrease, not increase. New cheaper computers, well, there's not an obvious relationship or link between computers and apple production, so probably we could not really know that the influence of that on apple production. However, the last one, if there was a decrease in demand for lambs, that means the price of lambs would fall and farmers would switch production away from lambs into apple production because they're related goods in that they use the same resources. And so farmers looking for the best return on their land or their resources will prefer to put more resources into apple production, and because lamb production is less profitable. So D would be the answer I would choose. In the next example, you can see lamb production hasn't changed, the capacity to produce, but apples production now can increase because of an increase in, remember, either resources or technology. So which of the following would have caused a shift from A to B? In other words, an increase in the productive capacity of apples. Well, genetic improvements made to lamb production would have moved the curve out and up from lambs. And the second one, B, a decrease in demand for lambs, of course, would have meant that there would have been no change in the capacity to produce of lambs, and it certainly wouldn't have affected in any way apple production. C, a new insecticide is introduced that destroys pests that cause diseases in apples. Now there is an example of new technology that would increase the capacity to produce apples. So the answer has to be C. And the last one, if the government introduced a new tax on lamb production, again, that wouldn't affect the capacity to produce lambs, just the costs would rise. That will be studied later. This next one is an interesting question because if you're operating at point X, remember you have resources that are unemployed. So if resources are unemployed and you want to increase production, you want to increase production of both consumer goods and other goods, you can. There's no opportunity cost because resources are unemployed. And so those unemployed resources can be used to produce more consumer goods and more of other goods. The only time you'll have opportunity cost is if you're operating on the curve. In other words, once you reach any point on the curve, all resources are fully employed, and therefore to produce any more of one good means you have to give up production of another, but you have to be on the curve. Here we're inside the curve, so there's going to be no opportunity cost. Number 12, after technological progress has taken place, what is the opportunity cost in capital goods of producing OX consumer goods? Well, if we look first at the inside curve, before technological progress has taken place, to produce OX, you can also produce OY. So how much capital good output did you give up in order to produce OX? Remember, you get OY production of capital goods when you produce OX, but if you had put all your resources into capital goods, you could have produced OM. So MY is the opportunity cost of producing OX on the inside curve. After technological progress, the curve moves out. You're still producing OX, but now you can produce OF capital goods. So what did you give up? Well, if you had put all your resources now into producing capital goods, you could produce OH. Therefore, to produce OX consumer goods, you still can produce OF capital goods, but you've given up HF production of capital goods to do that. So the answer is, of course, B. I'll leave this for you to complete yourself, and you can check with me in the teaching session your answers. Now, it's very important in economics that you work on your vocabulary. It's very much a new language, and the study of economics is, and it has many technical words, and so it is really important that you develop vocab lists. And by lists, I mean they should be very, very brief in their explanation. Ideally, you write the term, and then you find words that will help you remember and recognize what the economic term is. And if you have to use your own language in the explanation in terms of writing similar meaning words, words that are synonyms, to help you recognize what the economic term is. You don't want to be writing sentences, long sentences explaining each one, because most of the terms you can find those long explanations either in the notes or in your translators. But here what you want is to find a quick and easy way of recognizing and remembering economic terms. So my advice to you is don't write sentences, write words that will help you recognize the meaning of the term.